So this is the masthead of William Lloyd Garrison's original abolitionist newspaper, but it's colorized because it's the Liberator dot today. The Jewish Bible, the Christian Old Testament, is fundamentally a literature of hope. Yet at least in Christian circles, the Old Testament has such a caricatured reputation as a tradition of law, judgment, and wrath. That was theologian Walter Brueggemann, and he thinks we've misread the Old Testament. Jews and Christians after them, he writes, are a people of hope, but they can be a people of hope only if they are not alienated from and ignorant of their tradition. My name is Lowell Bliss. Welcome to episode number 13 of the Liberator Today's video series on hope. It's time in this series that we got a taste of a complete body of work from Walter Brueggemann, and not just a quotation here and an allusion there. Let's take a look at his lecture, Living Toward a Vision, Grief in the Midst of Technique, which is reprinted in the 1987 book, Hope Within History. The reason we've been alienated from or ignorant of the Old Testament's tradition of hope, according to Brueggemann, is because, quote, the dominant intellectual tradition of the West, unquote, through which we read scriptures, is based on Hellenistic philosophy that seeks order and control. Hope is messier, more open-ended than that. Brueggemann believes, quote, we are in a season when the urge for order seems nearly to squeeze out the voice of hope. For that reason, to reflect on this tradition of hope is an important exercise for us. He identifies 5 elements of hope literature in the Old Testament. First, the Genesis narratives of the patriarchs are essentially narratives of hope. Quote, the overriding substance of this literature is a promise from God that is open-ended in its scope and definitions and is brought to fulfillment only by the fidelity of God. Unquote. Abraham and Sarah are promised an heir despite their barrenness, but also a great name, a new land, a blessing to the nations. The stories of the patriarchs instruct Jews and Christians that, quote, the hopelessness of the data never rules out a different possibility. God can indeed work a newness against all the data. Secondly, Old Testament prophets are often portrayed as turn or burn preachers or prescient predictors. But Brueggemann understands them as poets who tell an imaginative story of the future. Behold, the days are coming, the prophets proclaim. Quote, God has no final commitment to the present ordering of things, which will be drastically displaced by a wholly new order. The new order is not at all to be established by human plan, human knowledge, or human power. It is the inscrutable, irresistible work of God. Unquote. An example of this vision is Micah chapter 4. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Thirdly, a third element of hope is apocalyptic. If the previous form of hope exists within the historical process, that is, it could be fulfilled by God in the return from exile or the rebuilding of the temple, the ultimate defeat of Israel's enemies, apocalyptic hope seems to exist at the end of history. An example is Zechariah 14. On that day, living waters shall flow out of Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea and half of them to the western sea. It shall continue in summer as in winter, and the Lord will become king over all the earth. On that day, the Lord will be one, and his name one. Brueggemann writes, the canvas for Israel's hope cannot be contained or domesticated within the historical process. It must be as comprehensive as the lordly splendor of Yahweh. Fourthly, in both prophetic and apocalyptic texts, we are presented with what Brueggemann claims is the overarching metaphor of biblical faith, namely the kingdom of God, the rule of God, the ordering of life according to the purpose and will of God. David or Solomon in all his glory is but a shadow. Even then, a theme of this metaphor is displacement. This hoped-for kingdom when God's will is fully visible, will displace all the orderings and all the kingdoms of life that now claim our allegiance, as in Revelation 11:15. The metaphor of the kingdom is a radical, revolutionary metaphor which stands in judgment over all the power arrangements presently available. The promised kingdom places all current relationships in jeopardy. The final dimension of biblical hope that Brueggemann mentions is that both Jews and Christians wait for the Messiah who is to come. He fully believes that, quote, for the theme of hope, it does not matter greatly that Jews wait for a first coming and Christians wait for the second coming. Jews and Christians stand waiting together. One reason I like this is because we Christians can wait as rigorously in hope for Jesus as the Old Testament holdouts Simeon and Anna did for the baby Messiah, Luke 2. The unbelieving world, by contrast, are waiting for Godot, who never comes. Quote, against such despair, these convictions of faith know about a coming one who precludes resignation and despair. Here's a good summary paragraph. This catalog of biblical texts shows that hope belongs centrally and decisively to biblical faith. There is no way around it if one wants to take the Bible seriously. These faith communities of Christians and Jews live in a passionate and profound hope that the world will become the world God intends, the world for which we yearn. In the following weeks, we'll finish out Brueggemann's essay with three issues. What is the function of hope? What is the normal habitat of hope? And who are the enemies of hope? I'm Lowell Bliss, environmental missionary and climate activist. Thank you for visiting the Liberator today.